On that sunny summer morning, nobody could imagine what was to come. Alex, Sarah, Mike, and Emily were a group of inseparable friends, bonded by years of friendship and adventures. This time, the plan seemed simple and fun. To camp for a weekend in a small town in the interior of the United States, surrounded by a vast and mysterious forest. Alex, always the most adventurous, was the one who suggested the trip. He had heard of a remote spot, a few hours' drive from the city, that offered an authentic camping experience amidst the wild nature. Without hesitation, the friends rented a car and set off, filled with expectations. The town they arrived at was modest, almost forgotten by time. The streets were deserted, and the silence that enveloped the place was almost disturbing. Perfect for what we're looking for, Alex joked, unaware of what awaited him. They stopped at a small convenience store to buy supplies. The store owner, an old man with a suspicious gaze, watched them as they filled their cart with food and lanterns. "You going into the forest?" asked the man, his hoarse voice echoing in the quiet store. "Yes, we're going to camp there. I've heard it's beautiful," replied Emily, with her infectious enthusiasm. The old man frowned, his eyes narrowing. "I'd stay away from that place if I were you," he muttered, almost as if speaking to himself. Sarah, who had always been the most rational of the group, noticed the sinister tone in the man's voice, but the others laughed it off. They were there to have fun, and nothing, not even a superstitious old man, was going to ruin their plans. They grabbed what they needed and continued on to the forest entrance. The sun was beginning to set when they arrived. The sky, painted in shades of orange and purple, created a peaceful atmosphere, yet something seemed out of place. The forest, though beautiful, had an eerie presence. The wind blowing through the trees seemed to whisper secrets that humans were not meant to hear. As they set up their tents, Alex, Mike, Sarah, and Emily settled around a campfire, chatting and sharing stories. They laughed loudly, unaware that as the night progressed, the environment around them became more hostile. The silence of the forest was so profound that even the crackling of the burning wood in the campfires sounded like thunder. The usual sounds of nature, common in any forest, were absent here. There were no cricket songs, nor rustling leaves, just the chilling wind and the growing darkness. As the hours passed, the group began to feel an increasing discomfort. Mike, the joker of the group, suggested that maybe the old man at the store had been right about the forest. They laughed, but deep down, the unease was there, hanging over them like an invisible shadow. Sarah, who had been quiet until then, watched the darkness around them with a look of concern. She whispered to Alex, "Don't you find it strange? It's too quiet." Alex, trying to keep the atmosphere light, replied, "It's probably just our silly fear. Nothing more is going to happen here." However, Emily, who had stepped away to get something from her backpack, heard a sound. It was low, almost imperceptible, but unlike any noise they had heard that night. It sounded like a dragging, as if something or someone was moving in the shadows. Emily froze for a moment, and as she turned back, she saw something move among the trees. Something big. "Guys," she began, her voice trembling. Before she could continue, the sound ceased, and everything returned to calm. The friends exchanged nervous glances but decided it was best to ignore it. They didn't want to admit it, but something was watching them that night. Something that didn't belong to this world. The night was advancing quickly, and the once vibrant campfire seemed more fragile, as if its light was not enough to ward off the darkness around them. The discomfort among the friends was growing, but no one wanted to be the first to admit their fear. Sarah, the most cautious, kept her gaze fixed on the darkness, while Mike, always the joker, tried to lighten the mood by telling jokes, though with each passing minute the tension in the air became more palpable. "What do you think that old man was trying to tell us?" Sarah asked, breaking the sudden silence. "Oh, he just wanted to scare us like those small-town legends, you know?" Mike responded, trying to sound confident, but the hesitation in his voice was noticeable. Alex, however, wasn't so sure. He was the type who loved the unknown, but something about that place bothered him. The absence of sound, the strange lack of life in the forest, and above all, that constant feeling of being watched. Emily was still disturbed by what she had seen, or thought she had seen, between the trees. "Guys, I swear I saw something," she said, her voice wavering. "It was moving, big, shadowy." Mike laughed, although his eyes reflected concern. "Probably just a deer or a bear. We're in the middle of the forest, it's normal." But before they could continue discussing, a sound broke the silence. A snap of branches breaking under the weight of something, followed by a low rustling, as if something was approaching. Everyone froze. The sound seemed to come from all directions, surrounding them. "What was that?" Sarah whispered, fear evident on her face. Alex grabbed a flashlight and pointed it around the forest, but the beam of light seemed to be swallowed by the thick darkness between the trees. Fear quickly spread through the group, and for the first time that night, they realized they might not be alone. "Let's get inside the tents," Emily suggested, her voice trembling. "Maybe it's just our imagination, but it's better if we stay together." Everyone agreed, and they quickly began to extinguish the campfire and pack up. The atmosphere of fun had completely disappeared. Now, the only thing that mattered was the feeling of imminent danger. They entered their tents, trying to create a barrier between themselves and whatever was outside. The night seemed endless. The friends, one by one, were overcome by fatigue, except for Alex, who couldn't sleep. Something was wrong, and he knew it. The flashlight by his side flickered weakly, nearly out of battery, but he held it tightly, as if its light was the only thing keeping him safe. Suddenly, a sound came from outside the tent. It wasn't the rustling of branches or the wind. It was closer, like heavy, slow steps dragging on the ground. Alex quickly got up, waking Sarah, who was sleeping beside him. She looked at him, alarmed, but before they could say anything, they heard heavy breathing from the other side of the thin tent fabric. "What is that?" Sarah whispered, her face pale. Alex tried to look through the small plastic window on the side, but he could see nothing beyond the shadows. The steps continued, now circling the tent, and soon the others woke up, all in silent panic, unable to move or make noise. "Is someone out there?" Mike asked, trying to sound brave, but his voice faltered. Suddenly, the sound stopped. Absolute silence took over the night, and for a few seconds, everyone held their breath, waiting for the next move. Then the tent shook violently. Something had hit it hard. The group screamed in despair, and Alex quickly grabbed the camping knife he carried. His heart raced, and the only thing he could think of was that they needed to get out of there. "We have to run," he shouted, hurriedly unzipping the tent. Without thinking twice, they ran into the forest, leaving behind all their equipment and backpacks. Fear guided them, but the forest was dense and treacherous. Branches and stones made escape difficult, and panic caused them to stumble with each step. Emily, running faster than the others, shouted as she came upon a clearing ahead. "Here, quick!" They gathered in the center of the clearing, gasping for breath, with no idea where to go. The moon, now covered by heavy clouds, barely illuminated the path, and whatever was chasing them seemed to move silently in the shadows. Alex tried to maintain control of the situation, but the terror on his friends' faces was clear. "What is that?" Sarah asked in tears. "What's chasing us?" No one had an answer, but they all felt the presence. It was palpable, like an invisible force suffocating them. Suddenly, they heard a distant scream, coming from the direction where they had left the campsite. An agonizing scream that dragged on in the air for a few seconds before disappearing into the silence of the night. They looked at each other, terrified. This was no figment of their imagination, nor a common animal. Something was hunting them. The labored breathing echoed in the clearing, mixing with the faint sound of the wind blowing through the trees. The friends, still terrified, looked around, trying to find any sign of safety, but everything around them seemed to close in. There was no easy way out, and the presence hunting them was closer than ever. Alex, who had been trying to stay calm, looked at his friends and whispered, "We need to get out of here. We can't just stand still, or we'll be easy prey." Sarah, with tear-filled eyes, barely able to breathe properly, knew he was right. Emily and Mike, still in shock, nodded in agreement. With few options left, they decided to keep running, even though they didn't know where to go. The forest seemed to have changed. Every tree, every rock appeared to be in the wrong place, as if the environment around them was reshaping itself to confuse them. Alex led the group, trying to light the way with the weak light of the flickering flashlight. As they moved forward, the sound of steps and snapping branches seemed to follow them closely, but when they stopped to listen, everything went silent again. "This doesn't make sense," Mike shouted, desperate. "We've been running for minutes and haven't left the same spot." Sarah looked around, and despair grew in her chest. He was right. The forest seemed like a labyrinth, and no matter how much they ran, they still seemed to be trapped in the same area. That's when Emily stumbled, falling to the damp ground. Alex and Mike rushed to help her, but as they bent down, they all saw it. Partially buried in the earth, hidden by leaves and branches, was an object. A strange stone, marked with carved symbols on its surface. "What is this?" Emily whispered, her voice filled with terror. "Was this here before?" Alex stared at the stone, feeling a deep chill take over his body. This was not normal. Something about those symbols seemed wrong, as if they contained ancient and sinister energy. They pulsed weakly, emitting a barely perceptible glow under the light of the flashlight. "This is some kind of ritual or marking," Sarah said, her voice trembling, as she recalled the stories the old man at the store had mentioned. Mike, trying to stay rational, said, "We should keep moving and forget about this. We need to get out of here." But before they could make any decision, Alex's flashlight went out completely, plunging them into total darkness. The silence that followed was crushing, until suddenly something began to happen. The trees around them started to creak as if bent by an invisible force. The air grew heavier, and an overwhelming presence began to manifest around them. It was as if the ground itself was alive, pulsating along with the symbols on the stone. Emily, still on the ground, screamed in fear as a shadow began to emerge from the midst of the trees. The figure was indistinct, wrapped in a dense, dark mist. It had no human shape, but its contours moved as if they were merging shadows. Its eyes, two bright red spots, emerged from the void, focusing directly on the group. The terror they felt was instant and paralyzing. "Run!" Alex shouted, pushing Emily to get up. They began to run again, but now the forest seemed distorted. The space around them shrank and expanded in impossible ways. The trees closed in like barriers, forcing them to change direction repeatedly, while the sinister presence followed them closely, never letting them escape. "What is this? What's happening?" Mike screamed, losing his composure. In the midst of their running, Sarah tripped over another stone, similar to the first, and fell to her knees. Alex turned to help her, but at that moment, something changed. The air around the clearing began to stir violently, as if an invisible storm was forming. Then Sarah looked up, directly at the dark figure now just a few meters from them. She let out a scream of pure terror as the entity approached. The bright red eyes glowed intensely, and an invisible force lifted her off the ground, as if she were being pulled by unseen hands. "No!" Alex ran towards her, but it was too late. Sarah was thrown against a tree with such force that the impact echoed through the forest. She fell to the ground, lifeless. The silence that followed was terrifying, and the group was paralyzed for a moment, unable to process what had just happened. Alex ran to her, but as he knelt beside her body, he immediately knew. Sarah wasn't moving, and life had left her eyes. Horror took over Alex, who couldn't believe what he was seeing. "No, it can't be," he murmured, his voice broken by despair. Emily and Mike approached, their faces reflecting the same shock and horror. They knew they couldn't stay there any longer. The dark entity was still there, watching, waiting. It was as if it was feeding on their fear, growing stronger with each moment. "We need to get out of here now," Mike shouted, grabbing Alex by the arm and pulling him away from Sarah's body. With tears in his eyes and a broken heart, Alex forced himself to stand. They needed to survive, to escape this cursed place. But as they ran again through the forest, each step became more difficult. The feeling that time and space were distorting around them intensified. The clearing, which seemed to be the only point of orientation, was repeating itself, as if they were running in circles. The entity, however, did not give up. Its power was growing, and the friends knew they didn't have much time. The despair was palpable. The shock of Sarah's death hung over Alex, Emily, and Mike like a suffocating shadow. Each step they took in the forest took them further from reality, and the sensation that they were running in circles grew with each minute. The dark figure continued behind them, invisible but always present, like an inescapable force feeding on their fear. "I can't anymore," Emily gasped, holding the side of her body as she tried to keep up with the others. "We need to stop, please." Alex and Mike exchanged glances. The exhaustion was visible on everyone's faces, but they knew that stopping meant putting their lives at risk. The darkness around them seemed alive, pulsing, and whispering ancient, malicious secrets. The air was heavy, dense, as if the very environment was against them. "We can't stop," Alex responded, his voice firm, though laden with anguish. "If we stop, it catches us. I can't lose anyone else." Mike nodded, but the terror in Emily's eyes was clear. She was on the verge of physical and mental collapse. "There has to be a way out of here. Something we haven't seen," Mike murmured, trying to keep hope alive, though he himself was starting to succumb to despair. Minutes passed, but they felt like an eternity, running without a certain direction. Each tree and each rock became indistinguishable. The forest, which initially seemed vast, now resembled a maze with no exit. The supernatural presence was getting closer, and the fear was so intense that it suffocated any attempt at reasoning. Then, in the distance, Alex saw something he hadn't noticed before: a light. Weak and almost imperceptible amid the darkness. But it was there, pulsing softly like a flickering flame. "Do you see that?" Alex asked, pointing towards the light. Mike and Emily looked in the direction he indicated. There were no guarantees that the light was something good, but it was the only thing that broke the monotony of the darkness. "What have we got to lose?" Mike said, resigned. With their last reserves of energy, they ran towards the light. As they got closer, the light grew stronger, and they realized it wasn't a natural light. It emanated from something, a circle of ancient stones, similar to the one they had found earlier, marked with the same strange symbols. At the center of this circle, a small fire burned without apparent fuel, a flame that seemed to float between the real and the supernatural. "Is this some kind of portal?" Emily whispered, fear and hope mixed in her voice. Alex looked at the symbols engraved on the stones. They seemed to pulse with sinister energy, and around them, the presence of the dark entity seemed even closer. There was no time to think. The invisible creature was already moving among the trees, its red eyes glowing in the dark. "Maybe this is our only chance to get out of here," Mike said, trying to make sense of what they saw. "But how does it work? How do we use this?" Alex cautiously approached the stones. His fingers touched the cold, rough surface, and he felt a weak vibration running through his hands, as if the stone was alive. He knew they were dealing with something ancient, something beyond their comprehension, but they had no choice. They needed to try. Suddenly, the circle of stones began to vibrate, emitting a low, deep hum, like a buzz that made the ground tremble. The fire in the center of the circle exploded into a larger flame, illuminating the forest around them. Emily stepped back, frightened, while Mike positioned himself next to Alex. "Do something," Emily shouted. "It's getting closer." The presence of the creature intensified. The shadows seemed to dance around the circle of stones, getting closer, and the red eyes of the entity glowed with supernatural fury. Time was running out. Alex closed his eyes, trying to concentrate. He knew what they faced was not just physical, but something that touched the unknown, the mystical. His mind was filled with images, distorted memories of the stories the old shopkeeper had told, stories about ancient rituals and entities that roamed cursed lands. "There has to be a word, something," Alex murmured, desperate, as his eyes ran over the symbols on the stone. Suddenly, a memory struck him. The words of the old shopkeeper echoed in his mind. "Those who try to get too close to the darkness without understanding its mysteries, are consumed by it. But sometimes, the darkness itself offers a way out, at a cost. He looked at Mike and Emily, his eyes full of determination. "I think I know what we need to do, but—" Alex hesitated, his voice heavy with the weight of the decision. Mike furrowed his brow, worried. "What?" "Someone needs to sacrifice themselves," Alex whispered, staring directly at the mystical fire in the center of the circle. "I think that's how it works. The entity is hunting us because we've invaded its territory. It wants something in return." Emily stepped back, horrified. "No, that can't be true. There must be another way." Mike, however, looked at the ground, his expression somber. He knew Alex was right. From the moment they entered that forest, everything seemed predestined to end tragically. And now, they were faced with an impossible choice. "I'll do it," said Mike, his voice firm but filled with pain. "No!" Alex tried to protest, but Mike interrupted him. "I need to do this, Alex. You have to survive. I've already lost Sarah. I can't live with that. It's the only way." With one last exchange of glances among the three, Mike stepped forward towards the fire in the center of the circle. Each movement seemed to drain him, as if the entity itself was slowly sucking his life away. Emily sobbed, unable to stop the impending tragedy. As Mike knelt before the fire, the flame changed color, taking on a deep red hue, like blood. He looked at Alex and Emily one last time. "Take care." And then he plunged his hands into the fire. A scream of profound pain tore through the night, echoing throughout the forest. The fire grew, engulfing him completely, while the entity watched from a distance, satisfied. The sacrifice had been made. Mike's scream still echoed through the forest, leaving Alex and Emily in shock, while the intense red fire mercilessly consumed their friend. The flame, now powerful and vibrant, illuminated the clearing as if fueled by the sacrifice itself. Alex, with his gaze fixed on the spot where Mike had disappeared, felt a crushing tightness in his chest. He wanted to run, to do something, anything to stop it, but his body wouldn't respond. Emily fell to her knees, crying uncontrollably. Mike's sacrifice had been swift and brutal, and the reality of what had happened hit her like a wave of terror and guilt. Alex, on the other hand, was a mix of shock and anger. His friend had given his life to save them, but the dark presence was still there, watching them from the shadows, as if the sacrifice had not been enough. "It can't be. It can't end like this," Alex murmured, his eyes still fixed on the flame that was slowly beginning to diminish. As the fire weakened, something strange began to happen. The circle of stones around them began to pulse again, but this time more intensely, as if the sacrifice had awakened a more powerful and ancient force than any of them could have imagined. The ground under Alex and Emily's feet began to tremble, and the cold wind cut through the clearing, lifting leaves and dust into the air. "Alex, what's happening?" Emily whispered, her voice hoarse from crying. Before he could answer, the entity emerged from the shadows, more visible and menacing than ever. Its form was distorted, wrapped in an almost liquid darkness, as if the night itself was taking a physical form. Its eyes, those bright red points, stared at them, but now there was something different in them, an insatiable hunger, a desire to destroy. "He gave his life for this," Alex shouted, gaining courage and confronting the dark figure. "What more do you want from us?" The entity advanced slowly, its movements flowing like a poisonous fog creeping along the ground. It didn't stop, and terror grew inside Alex and Emily. They knew running was no longer an option. There was no safe place left. Suddenly, the ground under their feet began to crack, as if the earth were being torn apart from within. The pulsation of the symbols on the stones increased, and from the center of the circle, a dense, vibrant energy began to emerge. Mike's sacrifice had triggered something much bigger, something not even the entity seemed to control. "Alex, look!" Emily pointed to the fire that still burned in the center of the circle. The flame, which had diminished, was now transforming into a vortex of light. It was not just an ordinary fire, but an ancient force far beyond human understanding. From within the vortex, an image emerged, a silhouette similar to Mike's, but taller, with indistinct features. It was as if his essence was being shaped by the forest's energy. The entity hesitated for the first time. It recoiled as if it felt that something was out of its control. Alex, realizing this, understood that Mike's sacrifice had done more than just feed the entity. It had invoked something powerful, something that might be their only chance to escape. "Mike," Alex whispered, still in disbelief. The ethereal figure turned towards him and Emily, its eyes empty but filled with a kind of purpose. It raised its hand, pointing directly at the dark entity, which now writhed as if being repelled by an invisible force. The vortex of light grew, illuminating the forest in a blinding glow. The entity roared, its distorted form trying to resist, but it was as if Mike's sacrifice was opening a portal or a passage. Something was being unleashed, a primordial force that did not belong there. "Mike, is it you?" Emily asked, her voice choked up. The ethereal figure did not respond with words, but with a gesture. It advanced towards the entity, and when the two forces met, there was a violent impact. The ground shook, and a deafening sound filled the forest. Alex and Emily threw themselves to the ground, shielding themselves from the explosion of energy that followed. The light intensified, almost impossible to look at directly, while the entity screamed in agony. It was as if it was being disintegrated, sucked back into the darkness from which it came. The shadows around trembled, and the trees bent as if made of paper. The air was charged with electricity, and the vortex seemed to consume everything around it. Then, in a single instant, everything ceased. The clearing was enveloped by absolute silence. The entity had disappeared, and the vortex of light began to dissipate slowly, as if it had fulfilled its purpose. In the center of the clearing, where the fire and Mike's figure had been, nothing remained but the marked stones. Emily and Alex slowly rose, still dazed by what they had just witnessed. The environment around them seemed calmer, almost normal, as if the malevolent presence had been eradicated. Is he gone?" Emily asked, her voice still trembling. Alex nodded, although his mind was flooded with doubts. Mike had given his life to save them, but what had really happened there? The sacrifice had awakened an ancient force, and the entity that had hunted them was destroyed. But at what cost? They began walking towards the forest's exit, following the path that finally seemed visible, no longer distorted or trapped. Dawn was already beginning to break on the horizon, painting the sky in soft shades of orange and purple. The nightmare was finally ending, but the weight of the loss of Sarah and Mike would follow them forever. As they reached the dirt road leading back to town, Alex stopped for a moment, looking back. The forest seemed peaceful, but he knew something ancient still slept there, waiting for others who, like them, dared to enter without understanding the dark secrets of that place. And, even with Mike's sacrifice, Alex felt that the price they had paid was not yet fully settled. Dawn was a welcome relief after the terrifying night Alex and Emily had endured. The soft light of the sun began to illuminate the dirt road, and the shadows of the forest that had seemed menacing now appeared harmless. However, the void left by the loss of Sarah and Mike was an unbearable weight. They walked in silence, both emotionally and physically exhausted, unsure of how to process what had just happened. Alex still felt the echo of Mike's final moments. The vision of his friend, consumed by the supernatural flames, was still vivid in his mind. He knew that without Mike's sacrifice, he and Emily would be dead, or worse, trapped in that hell forever. But the victory felt bitter. They had escaped, but at a very high cost. "I can't believe they're gone," Emily said, breaking the silence with a tremulous voice, tears still streaming down her dirt-streaked face. "Sarah, Mike." Alex looked at her, his eyes swollen with fatigue and sadness. He wanted to comfort her, to say that everything would be okay, but he knew that wasn't true. What they had gone through in that forest had changed everything. They would never be the same. "They saved us," Alex replied, his voice hoarse. Mike knew what he had to do. He made the sacrifice because he knew it was the only way. Emily looked at the ground, sadness and guilt evident on her face. She slowly shook her head. I don't know if I can live with this, Alex. If we survived, why couldn't they? The question hung in the air, and Alex had no answer. The weight of guilt and loss accompanied them like a shadow, reminding them that what they had experienced was not something they could simply forget. The forest, the entity, and Mike's sacrifice would become permanent scars on their lives. After hours of walking, they finally saw the small town where it all began. The place seemed even quieter and more deserted than when they had arrived. The gas station and the small store where they had bought supplies were exactly as they had left them, except they now carried a sinister aura that they had not noticed before. As they entered the town, the convenience store owner, the old man who had warned about the forest, saw them approaching. His gaze, full of somber wisdom, indicated that he knew what had happened. "You're back," the man said, his voice deep. "But not all of you." Alex stopped in front of him, his body tense with the memory of the old man's words at the start of their journey. He tried to control the anger and pain that were close to the surface. You knew something was wrong with that forest, but you didn't say anything," Alex shouted, his voice echoing in the empty streets. The man slowly shook his head as if he had seen this before. "I warned you, but you wouldn't listen. That forest has a darkness that cannot be explained, and those who enter there pay a high price." Emily, with tears filling her eyes, stepped forward. "And what's left of us then?" she asked desperately. "What happens now?" The old man looked at them with a heavy expression, as if carrying an invisible burden. "You survive for now, but the darkness of that forest doesn't fade away. You carry it with you now, and it will always find a way back." The man's words struck them like a blow. Alex felt the ground tremble beneath his feet. The idea that everything they had faced that night was not yet over, that the entity or the curse of the forest might still follow them, was terrifying. "No, we destroyed it," Alex responded, his voice wavering. "That being the entity, it's gone." The old man sighed and looked away for a moment, as if he knew something they could not understand. "Whatever you face there, it cannot be destroyed. The darkness in that forest is older than anything you've ever known. It takes many forms, but never disappears. You may have weakened it, but it will wait." Emily, now crying openly, turned to Alex. "What if he's right? If it's still following us?" Alex wanted to deny it. He wanted to believe that everything was over, that Mike's sacrifice and Sarah's death were not in vain. But deep down, he knew the old man was right. There was something in that forest, something beyond their comprehension, that had marked them forever. "Let's get out of here," Alex finally said, taking Emily's hand. "We can't stay here." Without looking back, they left the town. The morning sun was already shining on the horizon, but for Alex and Emily, the light did not bring the comfort it once had. There was a new shadow in their lives, one that could not be erased. They had survived the night, but they knew, somehow, that the darkness was still pursuing them. As they moved away from the town, Alex took one last look at the road that had led them to the forest. A chill ran down his spine as he realized that, even from a distance, he still felt the presence of what had hunted them. They had won the battle, but the war against the darkness had only just begun. And in the back of his mind, Alex knew the forest was still waiting, silent, patient, waiting for its next victim.